I'm Not My Parents' Son, The Family Secret That Changed Everything, Reddit Stories. It began in the kind of house that looked warm from the outside, with ivy curling around the white wooden porch, lace curtains softening the glow of lamps at twilight, and flower boxes brimming with geraniums. To passers-by, it seemed a portrait of harmony, the quintessential family dwelling where laughter surely echoed in the halls, and every picture frame held a cherished memory. But beneath that serene facade lay a foundation of unspoken words and buried truths, the weight of which had begun to subtly bend the lives of those within. You see, every family harbors its mysteries, but ours was like a dormant volcano, its presence unacknowledged, its threat long forgotten, until the first tremor stirred. I should tell you about my mother first. Strong-willed, fiercely protective, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a look, yet whose hands fluttered like nervous birds when she thought no one was watching. She held the family together with the precision of a conductor, managing schedules, smoothing conflicts, preserving the illusion that everything was just as it should be. Then there was my father, stoic, dependable, a man of few words whose approval was measured in rare nods and fleeting smiles. We loved him from a distance, yearning for his warmth even as we revered his strength. My younger brother, David, was the golden boy. Brilliant, charming, the kind of son who made parents beam at school functions and neighbors whisper their envy. And then there was me, the quiet observer, the one who noticed the subtle cracks in our perfect facade long before they began to widen. Our life followed a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with the clatter of dishes, the scent of coffee hurried goodbyes. Evenings brought family dinners where conversation flowed easily around mundane topics. Grades, sports, weekend plans, while deeper currents remained undisturbed beneath the surface. We celebrated birthdays with grand cakes and carefully wrapped gifts. Holidays with traditions passed down through generations, each ritual reinforcing the story we told ourselves. We were a close-knit family, bound by love and trust. But even then, there were moments, fleeting but telling, when that story felt fragile. A sudden tension when certain names were mentioned. My mother's lingering glance at an old photo tucked away in a forgotten album. The way my father's expression darkened during particular conversations, his voice turning curt. It wasn't until the summer I turned 17 that the first real shift occurred. That summer was unusually hot, the kind of oppressive heat that left the air thick and conversations thinner. My mother had embarked on a mission to clean out the attic, a space long neglected and sweltering beneath the roof's embrace. I remember her calling me up to help, her voice unusually sharp, as though driven by more than just the desire for order. We worked in near silence, dust swirling in sunbeams, cardboard boxes stacked like forgotten sentinels. It was in the corner, behind old trunks and faded suitcases, that I found it, a small wooden chest, its surface worn smooth by time. At first, my mother dismissed it. Just old papers, she said too quickly, reaching to move it aside. But curiosity had already taken root. That evening, when the house lay quiet and shadows stretched long, I returned to the attic alone. The chest was surprisingly light. Inside, neatly bundled letters tied with a faded ribbon, photographs in black and white, and a leather-bound journal with initials that weren't mine, nor my parents'. The letters were addressed to my mother, penned in a flowing script that spoke of deep affection and longing. The journal told a story of love, one that predated my father, with a man whose name I'd never heard spoken in our home. I didn't confront her right away. For days, the knowledge sat heavy in my chest, coloring every interaction. I watched my parents more closely, noticing the subtle distance between them, the unspoken resentments that simmered beneath polite exchanges. My mother's eyes seemed shadowed now, her smiles more brittle. My father grew more withdrawn, as though sensing a disturbance without understanding its source. Meanwhile, David remained oblivious, wrapped in the invulnerability of youth. The truth gnawed at me until I could no longer bear its weight alone. One evening, after dinner had been cleared and David had retreated to his room, I found my mother in the den, a book resting forgotten in her lap. "I found something," I began, voice trembling, and as I spoke, the color drained from her face. For a long moment, she said nothing, only stared at me with eyes wide and unguarded. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she confessed. Before she met my father, she had been in love with another man. Circumstances, family expectations, societal pressures had driven them apart. Yet a part of her heart had remained tethered to that past, a truth she had buried for the sake of the life she had chosen. The letters were all that remained of that lost chapter, hidden away like a wound too deep to heal. I sat there, struggling to reconcile this revelation with the mother I thought I knew. My world, once so certain, now felt unsteady. And yet, in her eyes, I saw a pain I hadn't understood before, a longing for something lost, a regret too profound for words. That night marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. Secrets, once revealed, do not return to shadows easily. My relationship with my mother shifted, tinged now with empathy and a cautious distance. With my father, a new unease crept in, for though he remained unaware of what I had learned, I carried a guilt that shaped every word, every glance. Summer gave way to autumn, the air crisp and the leaves ablaze with color. But within our home, the atmosphere grew colder. My mother grew quieter, her gaze often distant. My father's patience thinned, his temper flaring over minor provocations. David noticed the tension, but remained unaware of its cause, attributing it to stress or the inevitable strains of family life. Meanwhile, I struggled with the weight of my newfound knowledge, torn between loyalty and truth. It was during this fragile season that another discovery shattered what remained of our family's fragile harmony. In the midst of preparing for Thanksgiving, a holiday steeped in tradition, where family unity was celebrated above all, I stumbled upon a hidden drawer in my father's study. Inside, a collection of documents, bank statements, legal papers, and most shocking of all, a birth certificate. It wasn't mine nor David's, but for a child born years before my parents' marriage. The father's name was my father's. The mother's name unfamiliar, absent from any family stories. The implications were staggering. My father, too, had harbored a secret life, one that predated our carefully constructed family narrative. Confronting him was inevitable, though dread coiled in my stomach at the thought. When I finally did, alone in that very study, his reaction was not one of anger, but of wary resignation. He confessed to a youthful indiscretion, a relationship that had ended abruptly, the child given up, the past sealed away in hopes it would never surface. Now, the symmetry of their secrets was almost poetic, though the irony was bitter. My parents, who had built a life on shared values and mutual respect, had each carried a hidden past, unknown to the other, shaping them in ways they could scarcely admit. The knowledge altered everything. Our family dinners became strained affairs, each of us navigating the undercurrents of revelation. My mother sensed the change in me, though I spared her the details of what I had uncovered about my father. My father, in turn, grew more introspective, perhaps suspecting that I knew more than I let on. David remained blissfully unaware, still the golden child untouched by the storm that gathered around us. Through it all, I found myself questioning the nature of family itself. Were we defined by the stories we told, the roles we played, or by the truths we concealed? The bonds that once felt unshackable now seemed tenuous, fragile threads woven from both love and lies. And yet, beneath the turmoil, a deeper understanding began to take root, an awareness of the flawed, complex humanity of those I called family. They were not the perfect parents of my childhood imaginings, but people shaped by choices, regrets, and hopes, just as I was becoming. What none of us could have anticipated was that the greatest revelation was yet to come, a truth so profound that it would forever alter the fabric of our lives. But that is a part of the story still to be told, the final tremor that would awaken the long, silent volcano at the heart of our family. And when it came, it would leave none of us untouched. The days that followed were marked by an eerie calm, as though our family existed in the eye of a storm we all pretended hadn't arrived. On the surface, life Mornings greeted by the familiar clang of dishes, evenings spent beneath the gentle hum of the television, conversations that skirted perilously close to the edge of unspoken truths but never quite tipped over. Yet beneath this veneer, a current of tension pulsed through our home, subtle but relentless. I became hyper-aware of every glance exchanged between my parents, every pause in their dialogue, each sigh that seemed heavier than before. My own internal monologue was a cacophony of questions and doubts, each vying for attention. How long had they each carried these secrets? Had they suspected each other? And, most troubling of all, what else might lie hidden beneath the foundation of our lives? It was during this time that I found myself withdrawing from friends and social obligations. Invitations to parties, study groups, even casual outings were met with vague excuses. My world contracted, orbiting ever closer to the gravity of home, as though drawn by the unresolved mysteries that hung in the air like thick fog. I spent hours alone in my room, the journal and letters from my mother's past hidden beneath my bed, the documents from my father's study locked in the back of my closet. I read them again and again, searching for clues, for context, for any thread that might help me weave these fragmented truths into something comprehensible. One rainy afternoon, while leafing through the journal for what must have been the 100th time, I noticed something I had previously overlooked. A name mentioned only once, tucked within a passage about future dreams that had never come to pass. The name was Michael. It wasn't the name of the man who had written the letters. That name I knew well by now. Michael, according to the entry, was a child. A child. My heart thudded painfully as I reread the line, disbelief battling comprehension. Could it be? Had my mother, too, born a child before her marriage to my father? The implications were staggering. Haunted by this possibility, I confronted her once more, though this time with far less certainty and far more dread. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea cooling before her gaze distant. When I asked her about Michael, her composure crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, her voice breaking as she confirmed what I had feared. Yes, she had given birth to a son, the result of her relationship with the man whose love letters I had found. The child had been taken from her at birth, arranged by her parents in an era when such things were cloaked in shame. She had never seen him again, though not a day had passed without wondering where he was, who he had become. The revelation shattered any remaining illusions of my family's past. Now both of my parents had children unknown to the other, lives that existed beyond the neat confines of our family narrative. The symmetry of their secrets was staggering, a tragic reflection of choices made under the weight of expectation and fear. Yet amidst the sorrow, a new determination took root within me. These truths could no longer remain buried. The past had already seeped into the present, now it demanded resolution. I began to research, driven by an urgency I couldn't fully explain. Using the scant information from the documents and journal, I scored public records, adoption registries, online databases. Nights stretched into early mornings as I sifted through countless leads, each dead end fueling a deeper resolve. It was grueling, often discouraging work, but gradually, fragments of information began to coalesce into something tangible. It was an old adoption record that provided the breakthrough, a match to the birth date and maternal name listed in my mother's journal. The child, Michael, had been adopted by a family in a neighboring state. Further digging uncovered more recent records, a marriage license, property deeds, even a social media profile. With trembling hands, I clicked through photos of a man in his late 30s whose features bore an uncanny resemblance to my mother's side of the family. Michael, my half-brother. The discovery left me breathless. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, torn between the desire to reach out and the fear of what such contact might unleash. Ultimately, I knew this was not my decision alone. I shared what I had found with my mother, watching as her face crumpled beneath the weight of decades of longing and regret. We spoke late into the night, waiving the risks and hopes of making contact. In the end, her yearning to know her son outweighed her fear. Together, we composed a letter, tentative, respectful, offering only the truth and an open door. Weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Every day, I watched the mailbox with mounting anticipation and dread. When the reply finally arrived, it was not a letter, but a phone call. My mother's hands shook as she answered, her voice trembling as she spoke to the son she had never known. I listened from the hallway, heart pounding, as years of silence were bridged by words heavy with emotion. Their conversation was halting, tentative, yet filled with a palpable yearning for connection. In the weeks that followed, arrangements were made for Michael to visit. The anticipation within our home was electric, charged with a mixture of hope and anxiety. My father remained unaware of these developments, a secret shared only between my mother and me for the time being. The day of Michael's arrival dawned crisp and clear, a rare moment of serenity amidst the turbulence of our lives. We waited at the front window, watching as a car pulled into the driveway. When Michael stepped out, time seemed to momentarily suspend. My mother rushed forward, years of separation collapsing in a tearful embrace. I watched, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment, and when they finally parted, Michael turned to me with a tentative smile. We spoke cautiously at first, our conversation a dance of discovery, each word weaving a fragile new bond. As the hours passed, it became clear that Michael was both eager and apprehensive to integrate into this newfound family. He spoke of his adoptive parents with deep affection, of a life well lived but shadowed by questions of origin. Now, some of those questions had answers, and new ones had emerged. Over dinner, we shared stories and laughter, the first genuine warmth our home had known in months. Yet beneath the surface, an undeniable tension remained. For one secret had been brought to light, but another still lingered in the shadows. I knew it was only a matter of time before my father learned the truth. The question was how and when. The answer came sooner than I expected. One evening, as I returned from the library, I overheard raised voices from the study, my parents arguing in tones I had never heard before. My father's voice was harsh, my mother's pleading. The words were fragmented, but the meaning was clear. He had discovered Michael's existence, and the revelation had ignited a firestorm. When I entered the room, the tension was palpable. My father turned to me, his expression a mixture of betrayal and sorrow. The confrontation that followed was painful and raw, each of us laying bare truths long buried. My father confessed his own secret, the child from his past, a truth that left my mother reeling. The symmetry of their histories was staggering, yet rather than uniting them in shared understanding, it seemed to drive a deeper wedge. The days that followed were fraught with conflict and soul-searching. Family dinners became battlegrounds of silence, each of us grappling with the shifting landscape of our relationships. Yet amidst the turmoil, a new clarity began to emerge. The past could not be undone, but perhaps it could be reconciled. The path forward would be uncertain and fraught, but for the first time, it was one we faced with open eyes. What none of us realized was that the greatest twist of our story still lay ahead. Revelation that would shake the very foundations of our family and force us to confront truths we had never dared imagine. But that is a tale for another time, one that waits just beyond the horizon of this moment. The atmosphere in our house had transformed into something unrecognizable, brittle as thin glass stretched too far. What had once been a place of routines and unspoken comfort was now a stage of fraught silences and unfinished sentences. My father, once the stoic pillar of our family, withdrew into himself, spending long hours in his study with the door locked. My mother, burdened by the weight of too many emotions, finally loosed, drifted through the house like a restless spirit, her smiles faint, her words hesitant. Michael, though welcomed in theory, was caught in the strange limbo of being both family and stranger, a role he handled with a grace that only highlighted the unease in the rest of us. And I existed in the eye of it all, the thread connecting these fractured pieces, the only one who held the full truth of our family's unraveling in my mind. It was in this fragile state that another thread began to pull at me, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. In the process of searching for Michael, I had grown adept at tracing family histories, connecting dots that had once seemed unrelated. Yet one nagging inconsistency remained, tucked within the adoption papers I had found regarding my father's first child. There was a name, Margaret, in the records, not the name of the child's mother, nor of anyone we knew. A guardian, a family member. The records were incomplete, but something about that name lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Driven by instinct more than reason, I dug deeper. Late nights blurred into early mornings as I scoured every database, every record I could access. I traced Margaret's name through public archives and private records, unearthing a trail that led me to a startling conclusion. Margaret was not a stranger at all. She was my father's half-sister, a sibling never mentioned, whose existence had been meticulously erased from the family narrative. According to the documents I found, Margaret had been institutionalized as a young woman, her record sealed due to the stigma of the time. But why had this been hidden so thoroughly? And what connection did she have to my father's lost child? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a key to understanding the deeper currents beneath my family's fractured history. I confronted my father one evening, steeling myself against the inevitable storm. To my surprise, the confrontation drew no anger, only a profound wariness. He sank into his chair, hands trembling slightly as he spoke. Margaret had been the family's shame, he explained. A brilliant but troubled young woman whose illness had been mismanaged and misunderstood. When she became pregnant as a result of an exploitative relationship within the institution, the family had arranged for the child to be adopted in secret. That child, my father confessed with a voice thick with regret, was his niece. Yet due to complicated circumstances and a desperate bid to shield the family name, his own name had been placed on the birth certificate. Whether through clerical error or deliberate manipulation, the record had long listed him as the father. The revelation was staggering. The child I had believed to be my half-sibling was, in fact, my cousin. My father's burden was not one of paternal guilt, but of complicit silence in a family cover-up that had haunted him for decades. The layers of deception ran deeper than I had ever imagined, entwining generations in a web of shame and denial. Processing this new truth was a challenge unlike any I had faced. I shared the revelation with my mother, who responded with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the tragedy of Margaret's fate, relief that the burden of secrecy was no longer hers alone. Together, we debated how to navigate this new reality. Should Michael be told? Would the truth bring healing or only more pain? Ultimately, we chose honesty. When we explained the full story to Michael, he met the news with remarkable composure. "It doesn't change what we've begun to build," he said quietly. "Family is more than blood. It's the bonds we choose." His grace humbled us all. Yet just as we began to find a fragile equilibrium, another shadow loomed on the horizon. In my relentless digging, I had stumbled upon yet another curious thread, a series of anonymous payments recorded in an old bank ledger belonging to my father. The payments were regular and sizable, made over the span of many years to an unnamed recipient. The timing of the first payment coincided eerily with my birth. A cold suspicion took root in my mind, one I could neither dismiss nor confront directly without more evidence. Driven by a gnawing need for the truth, I traced the bank records through old account numbers and financial statements. The trail led to a trust fund, one established for a woman named Eleanor, another name unknown to me. Further investigation revealed that Eleanor had been a nurse in the hospital where I was born. The payments, it seemed, were made to her or on her behalf. The implications were chilling. Why would my father be making secret payments to a woman connected to my birth? What did she know that warranted decades of silent compensation? The puzzle consumed me. I confided in no one, not yet. I needed certainty before I shattered what remained of my parents' fragile peace. My search led me to a small, nondescript care facility on the outskirts of town, where Eleanor, now elderly and frail, resided. Heart-pounding, I recollection was halting at first, her memory clouded by age and illness. But when I gently mentioned my father's name, her demeanor shifted. Tears welled in her eyes as she grasped my hand with surprising strength. "I never wanted it this way," she whispered. "But your father, he was desperate to protect you. To protect the truth." And piece by piece, her fragmented story emerged. On the day of my birth, a clerical error had revealed a disturbing fact. My blood type did not match what would be expected from my parents. Further investigation uncovered a devastating truth. My father was not my biological father. In the chaos and fear that followed, my father had paid Eleanor to ensure the records were altered, the truth buried. The payments were hush money, a desperate bid to preserve the illusion of our family. The revelation left me reeling. My very identity, the foundation of who I believed myself to be, was now cast in doubt. Who was my biological father? And why had this truth been hidden for so long? Eleanor, her strength waning, could provide only one clue. A name hastily whispered before exhaustion overtook her. Richard. No last name, no further details. But it was enough to ignite a new fire within me. I returned home that evening in a daze, every familiar detail of the house now seeming foreign. My parents noticed immediately that something was amiss. I debated whether to confront them, torn between the desire for truth and the fear of the devastation it would cause. In the end, the need for answers prevailed. That night, in the living room that had witnessed so many of our family's joys and sorrows, I laid bare what I had discovered. The reaction was cataclysmic. My father's face drained of color, his stoic facade crumbling as he confessed through broken sobs. The story was true. He had known since the day I was born, but had chosen to raise me as his own, believing that love, not blood, defined a father. My mother, blindsided, collapsed into tears, the weight of yet another secret shattering her composure. The foundation of our family, already cracked, now lay in ruins. And yet, amidst the wreckage, a strange clarity emerged. The truths we had uncovered, painful, yes, but also freeing, had stripped away the illusions and lies. For the first time, we stood before each other as we truly were, a flawed, wounded human. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with uncertainty. But perhaps, in facing the truth together, we could begin to forge a new understanding of what it meant to be a family. What I could not know then was that the greatest revelation was still to come. A final twist that would append everything once more and force us to confront the ultimate question: how much truth can a family truly bear? That part of the story still waits to be told, just beyond the fragile dawn of our new beginning. The days after that last revelation bled into each other, a haze of numbness that clouded every thought, every word. The house itself seemed changed, quieter, heavier, as though the very walls absorbed the shock of truths too long concealed. My father moved through it like a man hollowed out, haunted by guilt and the fear that I would now see him as a fraud, not a father. My mother remained distant, her grief raw and unprocessed, her once steady presence now fragile and uncertain. Even Michael, though not yet fully integrated into our lives, sensed the shift and kept a respectful distance. And I was caught between identities, between a past I no longer fully trusted and a future shrouded in questions. The name Richard echoed constantly in my mind, a riddle without an answer. Who was he? What role had he played in my mother's life? Why had she never spoken of him? And most of all, did he even know I existed? The need to know became an obsession. With every passing day, it grew stronger, gnawing at me until I could think of little else. The internet became my hunting ground. Genealogy sites, public records, newspaper archives. The search was maddeningly slow. Richard was a common name, and without a surname, each potential lead dissolved into a dead end. Then, unexpectedly, a clue emerged, not from a database, but from a forgotten letter buried in an old box in the attic. It was a letter addressed to my mother, unsigned, written in a hand that trembled with emotion. The letter spoke of regret, of love never meant to fade, of a parting forced by circumstances neither could control. But most importantly, it referenced a shared moment, a weekend spent at a seaside town 2 months before my mother's wedding this fragile lead. I delved into local archives from that town. It took weeks of searching through guest registries, event listings, and community records before I finally found a match, a Richard Hale, listed as a guest at the Seabreeze Inn during that very weekend. The name was uncommon enough to offer hope. Further searches revealed that Richard Hale had been a young professor at a nearby university at the time, a rising star in his field of literature. His name appeared in academic journals, conference programs, and eventually in obituaries. He had passed away 3 years ago. The news hit me like a physical blow. The man who might have been my biological father was gone before I had even known to seek him. A wave of grief, sharp and bewildering, crashed over me. Not for a man I had known, but for the possibility of knowing him. Yet even in death, Richard Hale had left traces. Among them was a surviving family, a widow named Evelyn, and a daughter, Anna, my potential half-sister. The ethical questions of whether to contact them haunted me. They had no idea of my existence. What right did I have to disrupt their lives with truths from a past they may have long since buried? And yet, the need for answers, to understand my own origins, proved stronger than caution. I composed a letter carefully, explaining my discovery, offering only the facts and the option to respond or not. With trembling hands, I sent it and began the agonizing wait. Weeks passed in a torment of uncertainty. My mother and father watched me with a mixture of concern and helplessness, unable to comfort me in a journey they couldn't share. Michael, now more a brother than a stranger, stood by me with quiet support. Then, one crisp autumn morning, an envelope arrived, the return address unfamiliar yet instantly significant. It was from Anna. Her letter was cautious but compassionate. She confirmed that her father had indeed visited the seaside town that year, that he had spoken occasionally of a woman he had loved deeply but lost. Her mother, Evelyn, had known of this past and had given Anna her blessing to correspond with me. Anna was open to meeting, to learning whether we truly shared a bond of blood. The door was ajar. Arrangements were made with deliberate care. We agreed to meet in a neutral place, a quiet cafe in a neighboring city. The morning of the meeting, I was a bundle of nerves. Every step toward that cafe waited with anticipation and dread. When I finally entered, I spotted her immediately, a woman of similar age, her features strikingly familiar. We regarded each other for a long moment, recognition and uncertainty mingling in our gazes. Then she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that eased the knot in my chest. Our conversation flowed slowly at first, each of us feeling our way through a surreal reality. We shared stories of our childhoods, our families, our hopes and fears. The parallels were uncanny, the differences illuminating. Anna spoke of her father with great affection, painting a portrait of a man both brilliant and kind, a father who had inspired her love of literature and nurtured her curiosity. In turn, I shared what little I knew of my own upbringing, careful to respect my parents while acknowledging the complexity of our situation. Eventually, the conversation turned to the inevitable question of proof. DNA testing was suggested and quickly agreed upon. The process was clinical, the waiting excruciating. During that time, Anna and I continued to correspond, building a tentative bridge of trust. We were both preparing ourselves for either outcome, knowing that the results would forever alter the trajectory of our lives. When the results arrived, there was no ambiguity. The tests confirmed that Anna and I were half-siblings. I was Richard Hale's biological son. The confirmation brought a cascade of emotions: relief, grief, anger, joy, all swirling within me in dizzying succession. My parents, when told, reacted with raw emotion. My mother wept openly, her guilt and sorrow pouring forth in a torrent of apologies. My father, though devastated, took my hand and said words I will never forget. I may not be your father by blood, but I will always be your father in every way that matters. It was then that I understood the depth of his love and sacrifice, a love not diminished by the truths we had uncovered. Meeting Evelyn was another chapter in this unfolding story. She welcomed me with grace and warmth, acknowledging the complexities of the past while embracing the present. Through Through her and Anna, I began to learn about Richard, not the idea of a man, but the reality of who he had been. I saw photos, read his writings, heard stories that breathed life into the silhouette I had carried in my mind. As these new connections deepened, so too did the healing within my own family. My mother and father began to speak more openly, their shared pain forging a new kind of intimacy. Michael became a constant presence, bridging gaps with humor and understanding. Slowly, the fractures in our family began to mend, not erased but transformed by the truth. Yet beneath this fragile peace, one final mystery remained, a thread I had almost forgotten in the whirlwind of revelations. In my initial search for Michael, I had encountered an anomaly, a sealed court record connected to my grandparents. At the time, I had dismissed it as irrelevant. Now, with everything else laid bare, I felt compelled to investigate. With considerable effort, I petitioned the court for access, citing my direct familial connection. Weeks later, the sealed file arrived. Its contents stunned me. The file contained adoption papers, not for Michael nor for my father's supposed child, but for me. According to the documents, after my birth, there had been a legal adoption process, formalized quietly with the help of family lawyers. My father had legally adopted me months after my birth, cementing the fiction of his paternity. But within the file was another document, a birth certificate. And on that certificate, under Mother, was not my mother's name, but another Margaret. The implication struck me like a bolt of lightning. Margaret, my father's half-sister, institutionalized, lost to history. Could it be? Had my mother been unable to carry a child and chosen to adopt Margaret's instead? Had the entire story I had uncovered been built upon yet another hidden truth? The pieces began to align in a horrifying symmetry. My mother had loved Richard, yes. But what if I was not their child at all? What if my existence was the result of yet another desperate attempt to shield the family from scandal? The questions were now too large to ignore. The truth, whatever it was, waited in the shadows, and I knew I could not rest until it was brought to light. I stood once more on the precipice of revelation, knowing that the next step could change everything again. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the story of my family was far from over. The final chapter still awaited, hidden in the tangled web of secrets we had only begun to unravel. For days after reading that sealed court record, I couldn't sleep. The words kept looping in my head like an unsolvable riddle. Mother, Margaret. It felt impossible, almost cruel, to think that after so many truths had already shaken the ground beneath me, yet another, deeper truth could lie beneath them all. And yet the document was real, stamped, witnessed, irrefutable. If it were accurate, then I wasn't even the child of my mother, or of Richard Hale, for that matter. I was Margaret's son, the same Margaret whose tragic story I had only recently uncovered. I couldn't confront my parents right away. The weight of this new possibility was too much, and I feared that voicing it aloud would shatter the fragile peace that had only just begun to settle over our family. Instead, I returned to the documents, reading and rereading every line, searching for any detail I might have missed. But the paper was clear. Margaret had given birth to a male child on my birth date. The adoption had been finalized within 3 months, with my father and mother listed as adoptive parents. The story we had all lived, the story of my origins, had been rewritten before I could even speak my first word. I needed more evidence. Records from that era were difficult to obtain, particularly those from the institution where Margaret had been confined. Many files had been destroyed or sealed under privacy laws, but desperation breeds determination, and after countless phone calls, emails, and visits to dusty archives, I managed to track down a retired nurse who had worked at the facility. Her name was Mrs. Turner, and after some gentle persuasion, she agreed to meet me. We sat together in her small kitchen, surrounded by fading photographs and the scent of lavender. Her memory was sharp despite her years, and when I mentioned Margaret's name, a look of recognition and sadness crossed her face. Yes, she remembered Margaret, a bright young woman, deeply troubled but kind, and yes, she circumstances of the birth had been unusual, she said. There had been talk of arrangements made by the family, the visitors of importance coming and going. The child, she confirmed, had been taken almost immediately, and Margaret had never been told what became of him. Her words hit me like a hammer. I was that child. There was no longer room for doubt. My entire life had been built on a carefully constructed lie. Not out of malice, but out of fear, shame, and the desperate hope of protecting a family's reputation. I left Mrs. Turner's house with my head spinning, the world around me seeming unreal. How could I face my parents now, knowing what I knew? And yet, how could I not? The confrontation came the following evening. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. My mother and father looked at me with guarded eyes, sensing that another storm was about to break. I placed the court documents on the table between us, my voice shaking as I asked the question that had haunted May. Why didn't you tell me I was Margaret's son? For a long moment, there was only silence. Then my father let out a long, shuddering breath. We wanted to, he said softly. We planned to one day. But as time passed, it became harder. We loved you. You were our son in every way that mattered. Telling you the truth felt like it would undo everything. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears. It was never meant to hurt you, she whispered. We were trying to protect you. From the stigma, from the pain, and from ourselves, I suppose. Their remorse was genuine, but it did little to quell the turmoil inside me. I couldn't deny the love they had given me, nor the sacrifices they had made. And yet, the foundation of my identity had been ripped away. I was Margaret's son, a woman I had never known, whose life had been marked by tragedy and injustice. I felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the mother I had been denied, but for the life I might have lived had the truth been known. The days that followed were among the most difficult of my life. I oscillated between anger, grief, and a strange kind of numbness. My parents gave me space, understanding that I needed time to process. Michael, ever the steady presence, checked in on me daily, offering a quiet companionship that helped anchor me. Anna and Evelyn, too, reached out with compassion and understanding, their support a beacon amidst the confusion. Yet one question remained unanswered, gnawing at me with increasing urgency. What had become of Margaret? The last records I had found indicated that she had been transferred from the institution to a long-term care facility in another state. Beyond that, the trail went cold. Determined to find her, if she was still alive, I launched a new search. It was a painstaking process, but persistence paid off. I located the facility, a small, private home for long-term patients in the countryside. With trembling hands, I contacted them, explaining my connection and my desire to know if Margaret was still there. The response was cautious but kind. Yes, Margaret was alive, though her health was fragile. They welcomed a visit, provided she agreed. The journey to that facility was surreal. Every mile brought a flood of emotions. Hope, fear, guilt, longing. I had rehearsed countless scenarios in my mind, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. When I arrived, I was led to a sunlit room where an elderly woman sat by the window, gazing out at a garden in bloom. Her hair was silver, her frame frail, but there was a quiet dignity in her posture. When the nurse introduced me, Margaret turned slowly, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. I approached, heart pounding, and explained who I was, what I had discovered. For a long moment, she said nothing, studying me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then tears filled her eyes, and she reached out a trembling hand. I always wondered, she whispered. I dreamed that one day, the dam of emotion broke. We talked for hours about her life, her memories, her regrets. She spoke of the pain of losing her child, the years spent in silence, the unanswered questions that had haunted her. And I, in turn, shared my journey, my search for truth, the love and confusion that had defined my life. It was a meeting both heartbreaking and healing, a bridge between past and present built on honesty and acceptance. In the weeks that followed, I visited Margaret often. Each time, we grew closer, piecing together a relationship that had been denied us for so long. My parents, to their credit, supported these visits, acknowledging that this was a truth I needed to embrace. Slowly, the fractured pieces of my identity began to knit together, not erasing the pain, but allowing it to coexist with understanding. Yet, even as this chapter unfolded, another mystery remained. A final thread in the tapestry of my family's secrets. Among Margaret's few possessions was an old locked box. With her blessing, I opened it one afternoon. Inside were letters, photographs, and a single, startling document, a letter from Richard Hale to Margaret. In it, he spoke of their relationship, of a love kept hidden, and most astonishingly, of his belief that Margaret was carrying his child. The implications were staggering. Could it be that I was, after all, Richard's son? That the tangled web of secrecy had obscured an even deeper truth? DNA testing was the only way to know for certain. With Margaret's agreement, I arranged for samples to be compared to Anna's. The wait was torturous, each day stretching endlessly. When the results finally arrived, they confirmed what the letter had suggested. I was indeed Richard Hale's biological son. The revelation was almost too much to process. The twists and turns of my family's story had brought me full circle, back to the man whose name had first set this journey in motion. With this final truth, a strange sense of peace settled over me. My identity, once shattered, had been rebuilt. Not on the illusions of the past, but on the hard-won truths of the present. I was the son of Margaret and Richard, raised by two parents who had loved me as their own, supported by siblings, both found and chosen. My family was not defined by blood alone, but by the bonds forged through love, resilience, and acceptance. Yet even now, I sense that the story is not quite over. There are still conversations to be had, relationships to nurture, wounds to heal. The path ahead remains uncertain, but for the first time, I face it with open eyes and an open heart. The final chapter awaits, and whatever it holds, I am ready to meet it. It's strange, isn't it, how sometimes the truth, after shattering your world, leaves behind not only broken pieces but also space. A kind of quiet, unexpected clearing in which something new can grow. That was where I found myself in the weeks and months after discovering the final truth of my origin. The weight of secrecy had lifted at last. I was no longer caught between versions of myself, no longer tormented by hidden stories. I was simply me, the son of Margaret and Richard, raised by two parents who had chosen to love me, now connected to two families that had, through unimaginable circumstances, become one. But life, as I was beginning to learn, doesn't pause for reflection just because your identity has been rewritten. The days kept coming, filled with practical matters. Visiting Margaret, reconnecting with Anna, helping my parents adjust to this new reality. It was during one of those visits to Margaret's care home, on a gray afternoon heavy with rain, that the final twist began to reveal itself. Margaret was growing weaker. Though our bond had deepened in the short time we'd had, it was clear that her body was failing. Still, her mind remained sharp, and during one of our talks, she looked at me with a glimmer of something unsaid. "Fear is one more thing," she whispered, her voice thinner than before. "One more truth I couldn't bring myself to share until now." She motioned toward a small wooden jewelry box on her bedside table. Inside was an old photograph, black and white, edges curled with age. It showed a young Margaret, unmistakable even then, standing beside a man who wasn't Richard. "This," she said, fingers trembling as she traced the image, "is your uncle, my twin brother Edward." A twin brother. The words barely registered at first. I had heard nothing of an Edward, not from my father, not from the records, not from the family stories that had unraveled so spectacularly. Margaret explained, her voice faltering. Edward and she had been inseparable as children, two halves of the same soul. But when Margaret's mental health had begun to fray, the family had sent her away, and Edward, he had vanished. The official story was that he'd gone abroad, but Margaret suspected otherwise. She believed he had been forced out, cut off to protect the family's fragile image. Her voice grew weaker with each word, but before exhaustion overtook her, She pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand. On it was an address, an old one from decades past. "If he's alive, find him," she whispered. "He deserves to know." After that visit, my mind churned with questions. Why had no one mentioned Edward? What had become of him? And why had his existence been erased so completely? The need to know was immediate, irresistible. I began to search. The address led me to an abandoned property, long since sold. But tracing the chain of ownership and following the sparse paper trail that remained, I eventually found a new lead. A recent public record placing an Edward Sinclair, Margaret's maiden name, in a coastal town several hours away. I drove there without telling anyone. Some truths I had learned must be sought alone. The town was small, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business. It didn't take long to locate the address. A modest house on the edge of town, its garden well tended but the paint on the shutters faded. My heart pounded as I knocked on the door. It was answered by an older man, tall, thin, with piercing eyes that mirrored my own in a way that sent a chill through me. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, as though both recognizing something neither could yet name. Finally, I found my voice. "Are you Edward Sinclair?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I am. And you, who are you?" The words tumbled out. My name, my mother, the truth I had uncovered. As I spoke, a profound sadness crossed his face, followed by something else. Hope, perhaps, or relief. He invited me in, and for hours we talked. His story was heartbreaking. When Margaret had been institutionalized, he had fought to protect her. In response, the family had disowned him, cut him off completely. He had built a life elsewhere, carrying the weight of guilt and longing, always wondering what had become of his sister. When I told him that Margaret was still alive, tears filled his eyes. "All these years," he whispered, "all these years apart, and now." We arranged for a visit. It had to be soon. Margaret's health was failing rapidly. When the day came, I accompanied Edward to the care home. The reunion between the twins was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Joy, grief, love, and regret tangled together in a moment too profound for words. They held each other, faces wet with tears, and for the first time, I saw Margaret truly at peace. But there was one more revelation yet to come. In their conversation, Margaret spoke of a box. A second one, left in storage years ago, containing letters and documents Edward had sent her before they were separated. Edward knew where it was, and after her passing days later, retrieved it. Inside were letters, photographs, and one astonishing document, a will. Dated decades ago, it revealed that my grandfather, Margaret and Edward's father, had intended to leave a sizable inheritance to both children. But after Margaret was institutionalized and Edward disowned, the will had been quietly altered. The fortune redirected to my father's side of the family. This was the real reason for the secrecy, the cover-ups. The truth had been buried not just to protect reputations, but to protect wealth. When I confronted my father with this, he broke down completely. He had not known the full extent of the deception. He had been a pawn in a game orchestrated by those before him, too afraid to question the version of the truth he'd been handed. The guilt he felt was immeasurable. In the end, he and I agreed to set things right. With the help of Edward and Anna, we reopened the legal case, restoring what had been stolen from Margaret and Edward so long ago. The process was long and grueling, but it wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice, about truth, and somewhere in the midst of it all, our family. Fractured, reformed, forever changed, began to truly heal. My relationship with my parents transformed into something deeper, built not on illusion but on hard-won honesty. Michael became my brother in every sense, Anna a sister of the heart, and Edward, the uncle I had never known I needed, a source of wisdom and connection to a past I now fully embraced. As for me, I found peace not in the answers themselves, but in the journey. The story of my family is no longer a neat, tidy narrative. It is a complex, tangled web of love and loss, betrayal and forgiveness, darkness and light. And in that, it is more real than it ever was before. Sometimes, I walk through the house, This house that once felt like a stage for a perfect performance, and I see it differently now. Not as a place of deception, but as a place of resilience, a place where truth, though buried deep, has finally been brought to light. And in that light, we move forward, imperfect but whole. The story isn't over, of course. Stories like this never truly end. They ripple outward, carried in the choices we make, the relationships we forge, the truths we dare to face. But if there is one thing I have learned, it is this: family is not defined by the secrets we keep, but by the courage to confront them. And in that courage, we find not only the truth of who we are, but the freedom to become who we are meant to be. And that is the story I needed to tell. The family secret that changed everything. Yes, but in changing everything, it gave us the chance to begin again. And for that, I am grateful. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.